Thank you.
Always good to be here at the Graves Lecture. I don't know, well, we didn't plan it. We didn't plan to be talking about space in the new space. But indoor plumbing's pretty cool. But really it's space that's important. We'll talk about plumbing because I know you're all interested, but it's really space I think that's important. And why Emona? I'll ask that a couple times. It is the 2000th anniversary of Emona this year, which is in present Ljubljana, Slovenia. So that's one reason I thought, well, that's pretty interesting. And then you can see, you probably can't see, but on this is the city museum, and it says Emona, a city of the empire, which doesn't really sound all that exciting, a city of the empire. And in a way, it's not. This is not a major city in the Roman Empire, but it's still an important place in the province, and it also says a great deal about how the Roman Empire organized space. And the 2000 year is a little misleading too, because I was all excited about the 2000th year anniversary of this. It's the year 14 is the first recorded mention that historians have been able to find. We think the Roman community was older than 2,000 years, but we'll just go with it. So 2,000 years and a city in the empire, and it sounds really cool. Not a big city, maybe 5,000 at its apex. Maybe 5,000 at its apex, but so it's like the Chadron of the Roman Empire. Almost as cool as Chadron. The Roman Empire, of course, was huge, and by the time Emona is being founded, it'll be over here, then the province name is going to change, but Illyria is where it is. The cool thing about this space that is the Roman Empire is that it is spatially connected. And people wrote about this. They would they would first start in, and this would go right with your FYI class, Dr. Tucker. They'd start in London, what we would call London today, and they'd walk to Syria, and they'd write about it, which wouldn't have been that uncommon in the empire. I mean, people traveled, and they traveled on foot, but what's uncommon in the ancient world is they're not molested. The empire is an empire. You can walk that far. When you get to a new community, you know where to go because they use space in a very uniform way. You know who to ask for boarding. If you can speak the common language, it would be Latin, or in this part of the empire, Greek, but you wouldn't assume that everyone in there is speaking a common language. Someone would speak some Latin. But certainly the Gallic people of France would not communicate readily with the Armenian-speaking people in Armenia. There would have been some lingua franca, but what tied them together is they're all in this same shared space. So they know where they're at. So space is important. 20% of the world's population, perhaps, was living in the empire. And cities are important, and think of Emona as a city of 5,000 as truly being an urban space. I think we can say Chadron is as well. That was what it meant to be civilized. The cities are the centers. Maybe 30% of the population lived in cities. But this is an urban-based spatial organization that spans, if you're going to walk from London to Syria, you're essentially walking across the United States. So 6 months. And people did it. Their writings have survived. A little bit different use of space. And here you see where Emona stands. And it's not badly located. In fact, I'm going to suggest later on it's a pretty good location for a provincial city to be. And that's one of its charms. And I'm going to also suggest that it's a pretty good place for a European location. This little thing, this is the important city. Aquileia is a much more important space. And this can be connected by roadway to Emona, but this little red thing in between, well, you got vandals up there. I think people kind of know that they're problems. But one of the reasons this is such an important space within the empire is this is Alpine territory, and it is this line of defense, and Emona is part of it that's there, designed to keep not just the vandals out, but anyone who might wish harm to Rome, which is, you know, really anyone who's outside the empire would wish to do harm to Rome. So it's a defensive perimeter, to be sure. So it has other importances, but it is going to be founded by military people, which is very common in the empire as well. If you have questions as we go, feel free to ask, and if you don't, that's okay too. More space. Now, of course, this is the modern city. This is Ljubljana, Slovenia today. Space is important in this discussion. It's important to modern Slovenia. But the thing that stands out in the medieval city and what's become the modern city is this. People lived in this space before the Romans showed up, and people lived there afterwards. They tended to live up on the castle hill. It's defensible. You get a good view of everything. So the Bronze Age and Iron Age people lived up here. The medieval people that came after the Romans lived on the other side, and they lived in the flat because they're Romans, and that's how they do business. So they organized their space, extremely different. It's a beautiful city. It could be a good place to be young, I would think. There's a vibrant cafe culture. This is where the wall would have been. So these are the oldest extant buildings. They were date probably from the 1600s after the Turkish threat subsides, and this is where the wall would have stood. The buildings behind it are the elite buildings from the Habsburg era. It was a German-dominated city, and probably the oldest that are standing are 1700s, but cities constantly rebuild themselves. The oldest things that weren't Roman were dating from the 1300s. There's a few churches that are that ancient, but it's really this space. And also keep in mind, you can't tell from this, but the streets kind of go willy-nilly and there's alleyways. I think probably the oldest built things were the alleyways, coming down between these buildings. Have some pretty ancient cobbles. A modern use of space in most European cities is they close the old town off to traffic, which makes it really charming. People come out every night and meet, and the river's important to this story. If you're going to have indoor plumbing, you need a place for the water to go away to. This is where it goes, into the Ljubljana River, which is dirty. I mean, it's an urban river. It shouldn't surprise anyone that there's going to be some pollution to it. It has a color to it. This is a karst plateau. That is the reason it's going to be turquoise if it wasn't dirty is that's the limestone that goes in it. But this is here, both the ancient Iron Age cities, both the Roman community, which is on the other side of the river, and the modern cities there because of this waterway. One of the reasons. I also thought it was a pretty picture. Going to Slovenia is like going to the sound of music. Those are the Julian Alps. It's one of the natural defenses of Rome, the Italian peninsula, is it has that big alpine barrier. So think of Rome as over here. So this is Bled Lake, and yeah, that's a church in the middle in the island, and that's where people go to get married these days. In the back is a resort. Modern people go to the mountains because they're pretty and they're comfortable. Ancient people would not have gone there. I mean, they had resorts. Only rich people went there, and they were on the ocean side. Most of Slovenian history, it's the size of West Virginia. It's the population of West Virginia. It's about as centrally located as West Virginia. It's not where people went for vacation. It's economically depressed. It would have been a backwater in ancient times, especially up in the mountains here, which doesn't make it less part of the empire, but it is not central. This is deep out in the provinces. This is about 100 miles from Ljubljana, and the reason I showed that picture is the city's really grown. Ljubljana is about 250,000 people, so the farmland is all covered up by a city. This is the Sava River. It's probably 100 kilometers downriver, and the Ljubljana River flows into this thing, and this flows into the Danube. This is a river transportation system, but it's the countryside that's important here because this is the fertile part, and surrounding Emona would have been fields like this. It would have been barley, wheat, all sorts of mixed vegetables. They have wine they can grow, which is very important in the ancient world. What they can't grow is olives. They would have to import that, and that oil would have been essential for lighting, and that oil would have been essential for cooking as well. So it has some natural attributes. They could grow food surplus. It's a great place to be a cow, I believe, judging from the amount of cows I saw. A lot of fresh milk, and if you're looking for good ice cream, the cows are right next door to the ice cream shop, and they don't go very far to get it. But again, you're not going to get a whole lot of ancient Romans in here. In fact, the people that are living out in the valley are going to be Celtic. They'll be Romanized Celts, but they are not Italians. Sound of music again. You're not going to make much, well, It's not a very big community, and you can see these hay racks. I mean, essentially they're cutting the hay for feeding the livestock to make milk and cheese, and you're not going to cram a whole lot of people into Slovenia, past, present, or future. More Sound of Music. I have nothing really to say about that picture. Space. That's the city. So the city of Emona would have been, so the castle's here, the river's here, and those buildings that you saw on the river walk are right there. So this is the high ground. This is level. This would not have been part of the modern city until 1900, but this is where the Roman city would be. It's on a grid. It would seem familiar to Chadronites. The distance from one end to the other, and we have the dimensions. It'd be like walking from the courthouse to here. Kind of north-south and a little bit narrower. So, not a huge space, but it's also on a grid, which is very typical of the Roman Empire. And the notion is that this is the perfect colonial city out there. They planned them out to be no more than 5,000, sometimes 10,000, but that's about all that those kind of systems could support. So if you're thinking about carrying away the human waste into the rivers and using indoor plumbing, more than 5,000 puts a strain on the kind of technology they had. So 5,000 was just about right. This is a good use of space. Now we'll come back to these notions when we compare it to the Celtic use of space. These would be the road systems. So the other thing that the Romans did was built roads. All over the place, all weather roads. A lot of them still stand. So this is going towards the main seaport, and these are going to other less significant cities unless you happen to be from them. And I think I'll call your attention later on to these dots. Those are Roman gravestones, the ones that they know about. So it's another thing the Romans did to really organize their space. When you're coming into town, you know who the important people are by who has the biggest gravestone on the side. So if you're looking for someone to do business with, you know who the big families are, which is a different organization than the people that came before them. And of course, indoor plumbing, which I know is the reason you're all here. This is in the City Museum. The big thing here, number 3, is the sewage pipe on the way out of Emona. It's lead. And it's placed on top of modern plumbing fixtures, but this is from the original plumbing system. The technology would not seem foreign if you've been like walking around First Street when they've been ripping it up these days. I have seen pipes very similar to that. And my next door neighbor, who was a plumber for a long time, told me that lead intake and outtake is not uncommon in Nebraska. But again, one of the benefits of living in Roman space rather than what comes before or after is you do have indoor plumbing, which is something that I won't mock. Okay. Kind of back to the notion of space and think about, it's not like the Romans were the first people to live here or the last. Another look at the castle. But previously, that was where all the activity was. And the Bronze Age people we know were there about 1,000 before the current era. And we know before the Romans, by at least 200 before the current era, 200 years before the Romans, there's an Iron Age community on the top. They knew the Romans. They traded with the Romans. 200 years later, the Romans are going to decide to annex them into their territory. For some people, that was brilliant and they liked it. For others, they fought tooth and nail to keep them out. Well, they didn't keep them out, but it's a different organization of space, and I'll get to that in a moment. The castle, one of the reasons we know so little about the Iron Age people is we presume that the castle was built on top of their settlement, which comes later. Again, probably started building it in the 1200s, but people who understand castle architecture, who knows what it looked like in 1200. What what archaeologists do know, and they get to this pretty late because this is not as cool as going to Rome and finding giant things. But when they come up here and look, what they're finding is a lot of Roman materials that have been transported up here and put into walls. So part of what goes on in the Roman city is after it's abandoned, it gets recycled. And they've done actually a very interesting inventory, especially at these lower levels where it would have been the original foundation. There's gravestones and other artifacts that would have distinctly been Roman. That's the building material. So I think there's going to be eventually some pretty interesting archaeological work on this building itself. But the city that comes before the Bronze and Iron Age cities have not been excavated, and the presumption is they won't be found because they're deep underneath this foundation. Another look. Again, you put it on top for the same reasons that you fortify any city, is that that's the vernacular for people who don't want to walk up but want to go see it. Pretty cool ride. This is not necessarily this Oppida, and this is what Julius Caesar called all these Iron Age communities. This would have been very typical of a Celtic community. It would have been walled, either with earth and then a palisade, a wooden palisade. It would have had all-weather gravel roads at least, and probably several hundred Iron Age people would have lived up there. The presumption is before the Romans arrived, this was the organization of space. It's on top of Castle Hill, and there are powerful Celtic chiefs, hanging around up here that are directing everything. Still very fertile farmland. It would have been densely populated before the Romans full, whatever that meant to what the climate and everything could stand. So, people were there before, and they weren't strangers to the Romans. Now, I don't know what they call themselves. I think that's been lost to history. These are the people that were living right around Emona. Taurisi is the best I'm going to do with it, and a lot of them we think get Romanized. They are probably co-opted into this whole affair and possibly even citizens of this space. It's not really clear how many Celtic people were in Emona. Their record doesn't survive. We presume they were there, but there's communities right by we know are Celtic. These Norici people are a little bit to the north, and they're a little bit less likely to be involved with the Romans until they're defeated. But they're still fairly powerful people, and there's a collection of artifacts they found from the Iron Age, and the axe is both a weapon of war and it's a very utilitarian weapon if you're living in a forested area. They were there. They're significant. It's not like they get run out. You have a couple choices. You can become Roman, essentially, which isn't a bad gig. You get to enjoy indoor plumbing. Or if you want to fight, you can do that too, but if you lose, you become a slave. Okay? So you got some choices. And people made the rational choice for them. It appears that there are uprisings, and this was originally just a camp, we think. But certainly there were Roman Celts kicking around there. There's just not enough Italians to populate 20% of the world. And there are advantages, I would suggest. This urn is not exactly on the site. This is an Iron Age burial urn. It's coming from, I'm guessing about 150 kilometers away from the site. What they have discovered is the Roman city was essentially built on one of these burials. So the Celtic people buried on the other side of the river. So they live up on the hill, they live on the other side of the river. When they bury, they put their dead folk on the other side of the river. Probably goes back to their religious preferences, and it's amazing if you saw Margaret Cole in town, she was talking about the Arapaho owl and the notions of death and ancestors, and I don't really know just how that plays in the Celtic world, but they seem to show up a lot in these urns. They want to keep them on the other side of the river. There's something porous about the afterlife to the Celtic people. They're not going to live on the same side of the river. Romans don't care. They're going to build on this graveyard, and they're going to bury their people so they can announce to the world that those are their people.
Do you think the site was selected to be offensive to the natives?
Pardon me?
Do you think the site on the burial ground was selected to be offensive?
Well, that's a really good question. Barring any written record that they were trying to offend the natives by doing it, I would suggest they just chose the flattest spot to do it. I think it's pretty clear if there's a lot of actually really good Roman textbooks upstairs in our library and some really classical works, but they essentially take Julius Caesar at his word. And Caesar says, nothing. We're stronger than them, we took them over, they're not having this discussion, you beat them on the battlefield. So I haven't seen evidence. Logically it makes sense. We're going to fly in the face of your traditions, but if you're a Celtic person and someone's building a graveyard, a city on your graveyard, you're thinking, we'll get even. If there is that porosity, those, spiritual world is going to wreak havoc. The Romans just, I'm going to suggest, are oblivious to that practice. If you're not Roman, you're a barbarian, and who cares what your religion is? That's cavalier, because I'm going to tell you in a moment they probably did care. It's a good question, but to have it addressed, you're not going to find it in the reports of the military people. And you're not going to find it because the Celts didn't write, but it'd be worth considering. I have no answer.
Okay.
Yeah. So why Emona? It's not a bad location. The other thing that goes on in this Roman world is that at any given time, 400 or 500,000 people are in the military. During this time, when the city is founded, we're suspecting that most of the legions are still coming from the Italian peninsula. They serve, they get paid, which isn't a bad gig. They get paid in a big honking gold coin, and if they don't blow it on gambling and wine, they can have a pretty nice nest egg when they're done. By this time, they're serving maybe 20 years, maybe 25 years. But the other thing that goes on in the Roman world is once you are done, they frequently resettle you. And they do it for a couple of reasons. One, it's another way to pay your soldiers for a lifetime of service. But Emona is a colonia. It is a military encampment, and we're certain that the 15th and the 8th legions, this was their reward. So the people that are the big players in this are military veterans. They become the leading citizens in a new community. And this is implanted throughout this entire region, and it works really great because this is a military frontier. On the top here, you're going to have active military service people. We'll come back to that slide. Between Aquila and Emona in the mountain pass, because this is vital to keep the really truly barbarian people from sweeping down into your territory. And then you have Emona just down the road, and you have essentially the National Guard, these very seasoned veterans, and if you need their help, well, they're readily available. So it's actually a very brilliant way to settle it. So you have that military component front and center. And plus you have happy ex-legionnaires. And it gives new people that say, well, 20 years is a long time to be in the military. Well, the promise is you're going to live in one of these brand spanking new cities, and you're going to be a leading citizen, and you might get land. But they aren't the only people that live there, and the reason we know this is that people in recent years have been very active in reading gravestones. There were 30 families that accompanied them, mostly merchant families, and about 13 of them apparently came from the Po River Valley in Italy. The Po would be right down in here, and we're not sure if they were Celtic Italians or not. It's possible they were, but that kind of gets obliterated. And then a bunch of families came to Aquila over, and they joined in, and they become the leading merchants in this community. So there's something going on here besides just being a military outpost. And we think it's probably commerce, because what the advantage of Emona is well, it's hard to get from here to here because it's coming by wagon. Once it's there, you have a river system that runs all the way to the Danube and then on to the Black Sea, which would have been in ancient times navigable. You can sell your goods. And the goods that go by river very nicely are foodstuffs, which Emona could produce a great deal of. So we have farmers, we have merchants, we have trade, we have a military garrison. It seemed like a really good place to put a city. Plus you have a couple of rivers and some nice sweet wells to get your water and then flush it out again so people can live the way civilized people are supposed to live. All right. It shows up on maps, and if you want to reorient this so it makes sense, turn it that way. This would be the Adriatic, and a little Emona here is the size of a lot of these other little communities, but these would have been those little planned provincial cities that get scattered out there, oftentimes for the military veterans. The more in this transalpine region, the cisalpine region you can put, the better chance you have of keeping Vandals out of Italy, which they apparently were always a little bit afraid of, and probably for good reason. Seen that one. I don't know why I tossed that in where I did. Just to remind you how big it was, I guess. A couple of words, which I know Susan is against on PowerPoint slides, but here they are. Colonia are the military colonies. So those are the people that are released from their service in the Legionnaire, and for their reward, they get really cool stuff. A house of their own, a farm of their own maybe. In Emona, we presume they're a Celtic people. There's no record of Celtic people. Their names aren't on gravestones. If they were there, they were probably in the countryside doing the farming. So these are scattered throughout the most sensitive regions. Municipia are going to be indigenous people, and there is a community called IG, just up the road. It's very close to Emona. It would have been a Romanized Celtic settlement. There's a quarry there. They were the quarrymen, so they were essentially providing the stone for the building of this city. It's not a bad gig. They're on the pathway to being Roman citizens. They're still possibly by their own design wishing to live alone, but they are part of the Roman system. So it's a different way to organize space, to be sure. And sometimes the two didn't really meet, and they could live certainly side by side. But again, this use of space is planned. Okay? The use of space is planned, and people understood immediately as they approached these things what they are approaching. Now the Celtic folks, there's probably someone who could speak some Latin there. But again, you're going to have these same rights within the Roman Empire such as they existed, like the right for free passage without being molested. Religion-wise, I mean, uniformity in an empire this big is really important because people are multi-ethnic, multicultural. Religion binds them together. Religion binds them together, and back in Rome, the senatorial class that's running the show, they dictate religious holidays as well. To be Roman, you have to say you are. You have to say it's okay. You need to pay your taxes, and you need to pay homage to the appropriate gods at the appropriate time. And for some people, that's not such a problem. We know in Emona, the god that was preferred in the Roman pantheon was Jupiter. There's more images of Jupiter in Emona than any other Roman god. Okay? But it doesn't exist alone. The other god there is not Roman at all. It's not part of the pantheon, and it's really, this little picture is coming from a place that's just a little bit to the east. But right around the Ljubljana River, there's a marsh, a very marshy area, and this is the goddess of the marsh. So next to Jupiter, this, if you're just judging who gets worshipped by the amount of stuff that's left behind, she's number 2. Okay, so it's a melding of culture. So this is the Roman way. You gotta worship a Roman god when you're supposed to, and that's part of the deal. If you don't, well, I think you know what happened to Christians. Okay, off to the lions with you. But it doesn't preclude the other gods. So this would have been an extremely polytheistic place, and as far as we can tell, there weren't a lot of Celtic people in Emona. They're adopting very local religious practices. Or maybe that's the evidence the Celtic people were there. I'm not really sure. Okay. Any questions at the moment? No. I could try. I'm going to say it's probably Acorna. You'll see it spelled a whole bunch of different ways. So again, this is an indigenous goddess, and this would have been a very Romanized pronunciation of who she was. But it's very local. It's very animistic. I mean, this is the marsh. This is the goddess that inhabited it. And, you're not going to do that 100 miles away because it has no meaning. There will be some other Celticized goddess.
Was there any, is there evidence, I should ask, of any non-Romanized settlements high up in the mountains of people that would just
refusing? If that's where they were going to be, they would be up in those hayfields. We know that the tribal structure is fairly intense. My inclination, if they're not causing trouble, they're not going to be an issue. Yeah, my inclination is there still would have been up there herders and folks. They probably were, because before the Romans show up, the economies are intertwined already. So presumably, if they are up there, and I see no reason to think they weren't, but they wouldn't have been very populous because there's no way to really, keep a large population. They would have been shepherds and the such. They would have certainly been involved in trade. Yeah, so the inclination is that you're not going to Romanize the entire space. But again, the space that matters is the urban space and the hinterland around it. So you would be talking about a very small population. If they're not threatening, there probably wouldn't be too much of a problem. But again, as far as evidence, that's hard to recreate because these aren't people that are writing, and the only way they can date anything is approximate. So who knows? Maybe they were worshiping Jupiter. But it's a good question. We have to presume that there were some up there. But probably more commonly, the benefit to proclaim that you were Roman would outweigh the desire to, if you're going to remain really, truly Celtic and you can't, you're going to move over the Danube. People certainly did. It'd be worth investigating. I mean, no one's doing archaeology up there, I'm pretty sure of that. Religions change. This eventually was a baptismal font. So what remains of the Roman city of Emona is not really particularly fantastic. You get some floor plans and you get some walls. The rest of it seems to have been dismantled or built out of wood. But what they're finding, and what used to drive archaeologists crazy, is when they find these beautiful mosaic floors, and they are really quite fine, durable installations. Initially, this was probably not baptismal. This was probably some rich guy's bath. I mean, he could not bathe publicly, but he could bathe alone. But religion changed, and by the 313, Christianity was legal. And by 385 or so, it was not the official religion of Rome, but all other religions were illegal. So there's this shift in here, and people are suggesting there's probably dates from probably the 360s or the 370s. Christianity became the glue for the empire. So from one end of the empire to the other, whether people were truly Christianized or not, they at least said they were Christian. And certainly here, since there's so much time and effort put into just this whole baptismal thing, if you think about kind of the modesty of this settlement, certainly the Christian community here was pretty strong by the time we get to St. Jerome, so right around 370 or so. So that shift happened. It's hard to say who was Christianized there before this time. If they were not telling anyone. But by the 300s, this becomes the new glue to hold the empire together. Instead of Jupiter and all the other pantheons, this becomes central also to be a Roman. This becomes problematic if you're worshiping swamp goddesses as a monotheistic religion, but it appears in the provinces the oldest religions survived longer. The argument that most scholars are trying to make is, we have this Christian shell, but the people out in the countryside are still out there worshiping willows and stuff. Another look. This would have been a very large indoor space in the ancient world, and that's not just confined to these little provincial towns. The use of space in these cities is a little bit different than we're familiar with, even though it's on a grid pattern. Really, if you had, the mark of your well-being, of your wealth, is really that you had leisure. And we don't think that they were lavishly furnished, but the mark would be you get to live in a fairly comfortable space and you have time to drink wine and write poetry or learn how to write. Gravestone. This is an awful photograph, and I apologize for it. But the gravestone's important here. Again, this is setting up to the world the Romanized space, and the gravestone is going to be very central to it because they're publicly displayed. They're publicly displayed, and it goes back to the routes in and out of town because people coming in and out need to figure out what's going on in that town. Essentially, if you are a person of means, you will demonstrate that by building a larger gravestone than the person next to you. So by the time you get to the center of town, you know who the big players are, and if you need to go meet them, you know their name. Does that make sense? And it's not that big a town. It'd be like coming into Chadron and saying, where does Dr. Tucker live? And they'd say, oh, down at the college. Or here they'd say, down at the Forum, that little space in the middle.
Are the gravestones at the graves?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, there are people buried under them. You know, so if you're looking to do some human archaeology, then you can find them. Yeah. This isn't Slovenia. This isn't Italy proper. Roman road. So again, that's the other thing the Romans connected the empire was with these all-weather roads, which today would seem a little bit uncomfortable, but in their time they were probably a little smoother and still travel. But you can kind of see the notion you're going to have big and little gravestones, and the bigger one you put up is you have the means to do it. So on the way in and out of every Roman community, they're going to let you know who's important before you even get there. And apparently this was really important for travelers. Life was pretty comfortable in Emona. The Hippocaust, this is the basement. And the floors would have been put on top of it, and down here, if you weren't, well, kind of the uncomfortable thing about being Roman is, well, being in the Roman world is that 30 or 40% of them were slaves, and that's probably true in the provinces as well. This is the heating furnaces. There would have been some slave down here stoking it all the time. The floor would have been heated. Okay? There are tunnels throughout these things. It would have been very comfortable ambient heat, you know, coming up on your floor. Apparently that's all the rage in rich people's homes to, you know, have these ambient heated floors. But this is what's left behind of Emona. You know, we're not finding, you know, grand graves. You know, they have some means, but what's left behind is people who lived comfortably in this very uniform Roman notion of what it meant to live civilized. Heated floors. How cool is that? Not as cool as well, maybe cool as indoor plumbing, I'm not sure, but this is also that same thing. This is your pipe. So again, this is the outflow. This is the sewer going out. This is another look at where you would be, you know, having your slaves heat your floor. So a comfortable life, not a huge footprint, not lavishly furnished, not very far away from your neighbor, but comfortable. I don't know. If you want to take the walking tour, there's the map. The wall. Now this is a military establishment. It took them a long time to find the wall. You wouldn't think. It was like originally like 6 meters tall, but it took them a long time to excavate these things. I think a lot of it got up on the castle. And this is, of course, is like a late 19th century, early 20th century neighborhood that it's built in. It was, oh, think about from wingtip to wingtip and then add a foot on either side thick. And there would have been, we think, 29 watchtowers around it. And this is not a particularly big space. What would have been enclosed at most is 300 acres. So this is certainly the notion that this is a place that could be under siege at any time, and this is a military installation. So the gridded part of the city is here. But it's not that everyone lives inside the city. The elite do, to be sure. Those big families whose names are out there. The potters, who would have been really central to making life comfortable, well, pottery is kind of a messy business. They're still needed. They live outside. They live pretty well as well. And then surrounding further, if you're looking for Celticized Romans, there would have been cattle herders and farmers. And again, it is all in the orbit of this particular city. So within the you know, farming bottomlands that are adjacent to here, it all would have been funneled in here to take care of this city. But still, even though Romans were cool, they didn't need to live on the top. They still had big, thick walls. But I guess that's just the nature of having a military colony. Even when there wasn't that much war. I mean, we're fairly certain there would have been 20, 30-year spans where the military did nothing. They were there, they were present, they were ready, but there was no one to fight, which is not a bad gig. Back inside the city, again, the thing that's surviving, these are those heat ducts that would carry your very nice ambient temperature around your domicile. A comfortable world. If you were wealthy and you could afford a nice beautiful floor or maybe a wall, although we don't seem to recover much in the way of mosaic walls, they were probably wood, but the floors would have been divine. Again, this is the mark that you have wealth. People come into your house and you see there's artwork on your floor, or it's not dirt, and it's understood that you're an important person. So when they started finding these, they decided Emona was more than just a city in the empire. well, but not very much more. Again, the potters were first class, and this is pottery ware that would have been made right on site. Some of it would be more simple than this. The amount of pottery that is actually on display in the museum is fairly astronomical, and I understand they haven't curated a great deal of it. But again, this is the Roman world, and this is what you get to eat off of. So again, you're living well if you happen to be a free person. That's an oil lamp. The predominant fuel to light the Roman world would have been olive oil. And there's, of course, a legionnaire, maybe Jupiter on the front. There was some discussion about that. Back to indoor plumbing, which is, I know, why we are all here. What makes Rome a little bit special, this is the public bath, not the bath. This is the public latrine. The public bath is right by there, but they just kind of know where it was. They don't seem to have maintained any notion of what the works actually worked like. The latrine is a little bit easier to reconstruct. It has running water. So what's left here, down here, is the ditch where your waste would, drop into the water and be swept out into the river. Ancient cities didn't smell particularly good, but Roman cities smelled better than most because they managed not to have night soil, as they would say in the Middle Ages, just kind of cluttering up your existence. So there would be water taking that away, and there's another trench in front, and this trench here would also be filled with water, and that is where you would use a sea sponge on a stick for your personal hygiene. Okay. This is not Emona. This would have been wood. You would have sat on wood. This is how they got to do it in Rome. So this is the sponge bath, so to speak. And of course your waste goes away and off to the city, and your city is left much cleaner and less disease-ridden as a result. There are also public baths in Emona, but they have not been excavated to the extent that the rest of it is. They know they must have been there. And they also know that baptismal was at one time a private individual's bath. So if you're really wealthy, you don't share. Okay? But if you're Roman, you get indoor plumbing too. Not quite as opulent as what you and I enjoy, but it did the job. Yes, ma'am?
Was there a separate space for the slaves, or did they use the same as?
That's a really good question. I don't know that. I'm sure they were, you didn't have them using outhouses because the whole reason to do it is for sanitation reasons. That's what I don't know. Again, you have those silent people. You have the Celtic population that must have been there, and you have the slave population that must have been there, and people aren't going to write about them. They didn't say, I kicked my slave to death today, which they certainly did. But they're not going to admit to it, or I denied him the right to use the toilet until he blew up. Yeah, it's that weird Roman world where we have that silent population, and I don't know. If they ever came out of the basement where they were stoking the fire, they had to. But whether they could actually use the same facilities as the free people, I honestly don't know. It's a great question, though, because they were ubiquitous. They're everywhere.
Well, this definitely is why I came. That looks very communal.
Yeah, a little close by modern standards.
Yeah, but what about separation by sex or anything?
That's a good question. I was thinking about that. Someone would ask that question. If my experience with Italians is kind of irrelevant, even in the 21st century. The bathroom might say men. Whoever needs to use it's in there.
The worst thing about it was it's just one sponge.
Oh. Well, there would be like a dozen sponges, but yeah, you shared.
You share sponge.
Yeah. So if there's anyone in public health in here, you can. But that was the gig. I mean, but you washed it off.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, my guess is that
But
gender didn't matter.
The Italian bathhouses and bathrooms and stuff, they may be unisex, but there aren't people sitting
right next to you.
There's a wall
Yeah,
around
my inclination is that
around you,
the notion of immodesty in the ancient world was different, and probably people did not have you know, that same notion of space and privacy, doing that kind of business that we've grown accustomed to. You know, I've not seen any indication that they were two right by each other, one for men and one for women in any of these places. So the presumption is they were sharing. Yeah. Again, if you had the means, you'd have one in your house.
But these are like public.
These are public.
Okay, so you have your house, but you
Right.
might not have indoor plumbing in
Yeah,
your
you might need
house.
to
You have to
walk
go
down the
for-
street. Yeah, yeah, you're correct. I would say that they were less modest. That's my inclination. Cool things are left behind. There's a few of these Roman lions that kick around. We think most of them are in the city wall. But again, that announces that you are in Roman space. These would have been on the gates to the city. So everyone knows exactly who they're dealing with. Not that they wouldn't have known before they got there, but there's kind of like flying the flag. And you see it every day. Most of the time you just know it's there unless it's at half-mast and then something weird happened and you have to know. Otherwise, it's just one of those symbols to remind you you're in the Roman space. Enjoy it, I guess. Back to the city for some reason. Oh, the Forum. The other thing that everyone would know is that all of these communities were organized around this square, and this is the Forum. It's not a particularly large space, and if you go there today, it's a park. And I don't know that that was on purpose, but that's exactly where the Forum would have been, and they've tried to recreate what it would have looked like at the time. It's not a huge space, but it's several blocks, and this is from within the museum, so the notion is this would have been both the government house, and the government folks would tell you when it's time to do the right ceremony to Jupiter, and then the rest of here would have been like a bazaar as far as we can tell. If you needed something as a traveler, you would start here. So this would be the norm in all of these little Roman communities. There's always this business. So if you come in from the outside, you know where to go to get your feet on the ground and start asking questions, get some wine, get directions to the public latrine, all the things that you need to do when you arrive in a new place. I think this is a little bit fanciful, but this is how it was drawn on a mural in one of the museums in that community I was in. What I don't think is they had those terracotta roof tiles there. Otherwise, they would be on display all over because that drove archaeologists wild as well. It's like, look at these roof tiles. Probably since this is a forested area and it's in the sticks, essentially, these would have been shakes rather than that. But you kind of get the idea that this is, it's your marketplace. It's downtown, if you will. So again, that uniformity, they would have been placed essentially in the same place in every one of these colonia. They are, well, I'll say carbon copies. I think that's a little bit cavalier, but what the heck. And finally, the fall. Well, the empire contracted. The empire contracted in places like Emona. Well, I've seen two stories. The one I think I put in the little blurb to get you here is it was burned to the ground about 400. Maybe it was. There's another narrative that suggests it's just slowly abandoned as Rome contracted. So take your choice. We know that the empire is going to contract, but this is a crossroads. We know the Visigoths, the Eastern Goths, who are kind of badass, crazy German people, were on the march and camped right outside of the community. The Huns came through on their way to Rome in 452 to wreak havoc, and they were bought off by the Roman once they got close to Rome. But in the process, I think Emona did not fare well with the Huns about. Some suggest by then it was done. We know the other guys, Langobards, show up about 568, but by this time we think fundamentally the Roman cities depopulated. Now what that meant for the region, I'm going to suggest, is like people didn't all just disappear, but essentially we're going to see the village structure return, and eventually people are going to start putting their fortifications back on the hill. So it goes, I think it just kind of eases its way out of this very Roman world. At the same time all that's going on, the Celtic people are being pushed out. And the people that are moving in right at this time are the Slavs, who are the lower class folks. They're still there. And we think people called the Alans are the new bosses on the block periodically, and then the cycle starts moving towards a different use of space. So 2,000 years anniversary, well, why not? 14 to 2014, but really this is vibrant for 400 or 500 years, which isn't a bad run for such a little place. And for a while it was connected to this greater world in ways that everyone in the Roman Empire would recognize. And I think with that, I'm open for questions.
Was Slovenia part of the Soviet sphere of influence during the Cold War?
Kind of, sort of. Slovenia was part of Yugoslavia. It was the garden spot of Yugoslavia, and the Yugoslavs were communists, but Tito, Josip Broz, was able to have some autonomy from that communist juggernaut, this, the Slavic giant.
So Slovenia became independent in like 1991 or 2 when the...
Slovenia, the Slovenia as we know it is from 1991. It was federated with the Yugoslavs, so they marked their independence in 1918. Before that, they were Habsburg space. They were dominated by Germans. Mm-hmm. Yep. Sir?
Kurt, life expectancy.
In the ancient world, 35, 40. It doesn't mean that people didn't live to be the ripe old age of 60 or 70. It's just, think about public hygiene. There would have been disease vectors galore. There also, we know in 182 there was smallpox. Well, we think it was smallpox. We know half the population died. As far as we can tell from the symptoms that are described, they died of smallpox. Women lived, life expectancy was lower because of the issue of childbirth. Once they lived through a couple kids, it's like the modern world, women tended to live a little longer than men, but 40. But again, the population pyramid will look different. There would have been all sorts of kids running around, and they're going to die of some diseases. People are going to get through their reproductive years, and if they're healthy, they can live into their 60s and 70s. But that would be a little bit exceptional. Yeah.
So how did the Celts get there? You've talked a lot about the Celtic population. I don't know if I missed it at the beginning, but...
Well, I just kind of kind of went with them always being there. They were the dominant European population, at least as far as we can reconstruct.
Okay.
And they're the ones who get pushed to what we call now the Celtic fringe. So how many people are Irish in here? That's all y'all. You got eventually just moved out of the way. So how they got there, don't know. Waves of migration, but we think the Bronze Age and Iron Age people were all Celtic. And the way guys like Julius Caesar and the people of that ilk wrote about them is they are these, well, I think really when they come up with these names, they're talking about confederations of tribes. I don't know what they called themselves, but they certainly had Celtic traditions. And you can see that in their ornamentation. That's usually what gets archaeologists, when they're wearing these certain things to hold their cloaks, and they wear the, well, I mean, if you know people with Irish tattoos, they have kind of the serpent patterns. Those kind of things would have been all over their decorative spaces. When they arrived, that's a good question. I'm not going to even speculate right now. Although in our library, we got a whole bunch of books on those, so maybe I'll get you an answer. But I don't know when they arrived, but they were in place long before the Romans. So by 900 before the current era, probably longer. Sir?
So the slaves that would like heat the floors to the wealthy houses or whatever, were those slaves owned by the government or by the person? By
the people. The slaves were private property, and they tended to be. They were defeated people, so prisoners of war. Now, and there would have been, slave markets to be sure, but it's not a, well, it is actually a fairly great distance in the ancient world to the frontier, but Rome's not always at peace. And it's not like Rome always stays within its borders either, but the people that would have been slaves would have been coming from the white space. They largely would have been Celtic people, although slaves can come from anywhere, from North Africa for all that it matters. So they would have been people that fought the Romans and lost. And the Celtic pattern was, if you're going to fight, you're going to have the whole nation fight. The men fight and the women and children stand behind them, and winner take all. So they're ample slaves. Their life expectancy is much shorter. Much, much shorter. I've seen some really astronomical, 80% dead by the time they're 12 or something. It's like, well, maybe. Just worked them to death. Anything else? Well, looks like my job here is done. Thank you all very much for coming.